Muito boa tarde a todos. Vamos dar continuidade ao nosso projeto no IDP e agora vamos começar uma nova fase, que é discutir questões jurídicas de um cunho internacional. Vamos trazer aqui grandes convidados e ninguém melhor do que o nosso convidado de hoje para dar início a essa nossa fase do nosso projeto junto ao IDP. Eu agradeço imensamente a presença do Dr. McGahn, agradeço imensamente a presença e ter aceito o convite de todos nós. E hoje nós teremos aqui na nossa bancada a doutora Heloísa Estellita, queridíssima amiga, jurista conhecida no Brasil inteiro, doutora Alaor Leite, que nos fala direto da Universidade de Humboldt em Berlim. Um prazer grande tê-lo conosco. E, de agora em diante, estaremos discutindo as questões que envolvem a Suprema Corte Americana, que envolvem toda a construção do direito em outro país, que para nós, juristas brasileiros, será efetivamente interessante. Eu vou passar a palavra ao doutor Rodrigo Mudrovich, o meu colega de coordenação, e desejando a todos os nossos ouvintes um excelente painel. Sejam bem-vindos, muito obrigado.
Obrigado, Ney. Faço coro aqui às suas palavras. Não tem forma melhor de iniciar a nossa fase internacional desse projeto com a presença do Donald McGahn. Acho que é uma alegria enorme recebê-lo, Don. Eu sei que ouvir sobre instituições, ouvir sobre experiências é sempre algo que engrandece, especialmente quando vem de um país como os Estados Unidos. Quero também cumprimentar ao advogado e meu amigo Eric Snyder, que se dispôs também tão gentilmente a participar desse nosso debate no dia de hoje. A professora Heloísa Estellita. Luísa, muito obrigado. É uma alegria enorme tê-la aqui com a gente nessa tarde de hoje, assim como meu amigo e professor Alaor Leite, que está ainda falando num fuso complicado, que está algumas horas à nossa frente. Muito obrigado, Alaor. É uma alegria enorme começar. E eu gostaria, Eric, se você pudesse, de você fazer a apresentação inicial do Don, eventualmente o primeiro questionamento, enfim, para nós podermos começar aqui nosso debate. Obrigado a todos que nos assistem e vamos em frente.
Sure. Thank you, Rodrigo. For your students and for the Brazilian lawyers who will be watching this, I know you'll find it very interesting to hear from someone like Don McGahn, my partner at Jones Day. Don was a partner of mine at Jones Day before taking the top job at the White House counsel's office. He was the White House counsel for 2 years under President Trump, the first 2 years. And he from that, I know, has a lot of insights about how the US government works, how the US judiciary interacts with the executive branch, and some of the important projects he was focused on while he was White House counsel. I think you're going to find it very interesting to hear from Don how one of the most important things an American president does during his or her term is to appoint judges at all levels in the federal judiciary that the president thinks would make good judges. And that's obviously of tremendous importance in the United States, but also in Brazil. And a great democracy needs a great judiciary. And the president has the prerogative to choose the best judges to make sure that that judiciary functions, not just during his or her term, but potentially for a half decade or more. Because if that president, and the White House counsel is very involved in selecting these judges and helping the president to nominate these judges and even helping those judges to be confirmed, those judges will be serving lifetime roles, and they could be elevated from the district court to the Court of Appeals and then to the Supreme Court. And you could see a 40-year-old district judge that's appointed by President Trump could be appointed in the next 2 decades or even sooner to the Supreme Court by another president. So one of the things I think might be interesting to hear from Don is how that process works and how that makes America a strong democracy in the end. So I guess it's probably best to hear from Don and not from me, but let's get some questions to Don for your students.
So, Alaor, if you want to start, Alaor, with your questions, maybe it's a good way for us to start the discussions, or Heloísa. So please feel comfortable, you both, to start questioning Don, and then we can start our discussion.
Then I'll take a ride. Oh, sorry. Go, Alaor.
No, you can.
I'll take a ride on Eric's on Eric's words, and then I will ask Dawn if you can explain us how the Supreme Court justices are chosen in the U.S. and how much influence the White House has on this selection.
Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, and appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. How Supreme Court justices are chosen in the United States is found in our Constitution. Under our Constitution, the President nominates nominees for the Supreme Court, and he can only appoint those persons to the Supreme Court with the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. Senate is one of two chambers in our legislature. There's 100 senators. There's 2 from each state. And it's not the only time where the Senate confirms presidential appointments. That's common, but it certainly is the case with federal judges. So it's found really in our enabling document where the president picks, but the Senate has to agree. What advice and consent means is something that is left to the branches of government to work out. The Senate feels they have more of a say than presidents sometimes feel. Sometimes presidents feel they have more of a say than the Senate. This is something that's been in our history since our founding. So there's always that healthy tension between the two branches of government. But ultimately, it requires, at least according to the Senate, a vote of the Senate. And if the vote approves the nominee, then the president appoints the justice, and the justice is then sworn in and becomes a sitting member of our Supreme Court. How much impact the White House has is tremendous, because the president is the one who makes the ultimate selection. Particularly with the Supreme Court, is very much a presidential decision, although he does seek advice prior to nomination from senators and perhaps others to get a sense of what sort of qualifications, what sort of person they would be looking for. Ultimately, it's the president's decision. So at the Supreme Court level, the White House is involved in every detail of the nomination from start to finish, from vetting potential persons for the president to consider, to advising the president on who he ought to nominate, upsides and downsides, making recommendations and the like. President ultimately makes a decision as the Constitution contemplates. And then from there, it goes over to the Senate. And at least in my tenure, I remained intimately involved in the confirmation process as well, meeting with senators, answering their questions, addressing their concerns and the like. And then you're involved again when it's time to actually appoint, because there's a formal commission that the president signs that has to be proofread. So the White House is heavily involved in Supreme Court justices. This is a little bit different as we work down our court system. We have circuit courts of appeal. These are regional courts that are throughout our country. They're numbered: First Circuit, Second Circuit, Third Circuit, et cetera. Senators have a little bit more say in who the president nominates there, because senators who represent states in that particular circuit expect to be heard and expect to have an ability to influence a decision. When one gets to district courts, which are trial courts, which is where most of the cases begin and end, the senators tend to have a much bigger say, because those district courts sit in particular states. Those particular states are represented by senators, 2 senators per state, and they expect to have a very large say. Some senators are a little deferential on those. Others think they pick them. It's one of these things that you have to work out. Again, when you have a 3-branch government, it's one of these healthy tensions that we have where no one branch is ultimately in charge. You have to work some things out. So that's the basic process of how judges are picked. But the Supreme Court justices, to answer the question directly, the White House has a tremendous role in Supreme Court selection.
Thank you very much. You mentioned this healthy tension between the executive and the judiciary, or the Congress and the judiciary. And we are experiencing nowadays in Brazil a series of clashes between especially the executive branch and the judiciary, and particularly the Supreme Court. And then I would like to ask you, why is that? the Supreme Court has the final word on some very important legal issues in a democratic state. And why is that so? Why is that so?
Well, the Supreme Court has the final say on some questions when it comes to what the law means. They don't have the final question on all questions. And let me explain that in a little bit of detail. Back in 1803, our Supreme Court in a case called Marbury versus Madison held that the court was the final decider in that case. The facts of that case are rather arcane and often forgotten. It concerned a presidential commission, which is a piece of paper the president signs that then makes one an officer of the United States. In that case, it was a civilian commission, not a military commission. I was an assistant to the president, which is a similar civilian commission. President signs a nice ceremonial piece of paper that you get to hang on your wall. And that traces back to the founding of the country, where there are statutory laws that allow the president to appoint these folks to these commissions. In Marbury, the question was when the commission became effective. It had been signed, but was never delivered. And the person who wanted the commission wanted either to get it in person or wanted to say it was effective. And the Supreme Court in that case, because that turned on the interpretation of essentially a statute in a way, because the commissions come from statute, but more importantly, it was a question where there was a dispute within the executive branch over when this commission vested, through a long and really seminal opinion that is still taught in every American law school on the first day of our constitutional law curriculum. The court decided that they were the ones to say what the law is. And the way they got there was that we have a constitution that creates three branches of government. The first, Article 1, creates the Congress, who makes the laws. 2, the executive, who takes care that the laws are followed. And Article 3, the courts, particularly the Supreme Court. And ultimately, it's the role of judges to say what the law is. Now, that's not always the final word. It's not that our court sits and decides all issues, and that becomes the final word. If, for example, a statute is passed by Congress, signed by our president, and there's an alleged violation of that statute, and the Supreme Court decides that the statute was not violated, that's the end of that case. So whoever was in potential trouble, they're not going to now get in trouble because the court has said that the law did not reach whatever conduct they engaged in. But the Congress could then change the law. They could pass a new statute that reached that conduct and start the process over again. So it's not that our Supreme Court is all knowing, all powerful, and the end of the road. It's just on certain issues, you need someone to say what the law is, and those are the courts. There's other issues that never reach our courts. There are issues that are conferred to each branch of the government, and the Supreme Court has said that they are non-justiciable or sometimes called political questions, meaning the Constitution assigns those to branches of government. Occasionally, people try to test that and they go to court, and sometimes the courts say they can hear an issue, sometimes they say they can't. But oftentimes they can look to 200 plus years of history of cases where they have not decided the issue. Instead, they defer to the other branches. An example of that, to go full circle, is the selection of Supreme Court justices. If there's a dispute between the executive, meaning the president, and the Senate over what, say, advice and consent means, that's not the sort of thing someone could sue over and go to the Supreme Court to decide how Supreme Court justices are picked. That is a easy example of a power that is enumerated to the president and the Senate, and it's up to them to figure it out. And that is why I say the Supreme Court is, some instances, final, but the other branches can have another go at it, so to speak, to change the law. So that ends up being a common thing in certain parts of our history. And sometimes Congress acts, sometimes they don't. When it comes to the Constitution, it's the consensus here that the Supreme Court ends up being the final word on what our Constitution means. Again, when it comes time to read legal text, it makes perfect sense for judges to be the one to decide what legal text means. But again, that's not necessarily final, because in our Constitution, we, the people, can amend the Constitution and change it. So if the Supreme Court decides a particular provision of the Constitution means something that folks do not agree with, the people can then change it through the amendment process and then change it. So ultimately, the power is vested in the people, and the three branches are designed to ensure that at the end of the day, it is still up to the people to decide how we govern ourselves. To amend the Constitution is not easy. It takes quite a bit of voting, and quite a lot of people need to agree to amend the Constitution, but it has happened. Our original Bill of Rights were only 10 amendments, and now we are deep into the 20s. So there have been a number of amendments over the years, so it does happen. We recently had one ratified somewhat recently over congressional pay. This was one that started years and years and years and years and years ago, and folks had really almost forgotten about it. And then, lo and behold, the state ratified it, and that gave it enough under our Constitution to become an amendment. And what that amendment essentially does is require the Congress can't set its own pay, it sets it for the next Congress. I'm probably oversimplifying it, but it's a check on their ability to raise their own pay while in office. So that's an example of something where the Constitution was somewhat recently changed.
Thank you very much. And I'll just ask a last question. How important is that the Supreme Court has the final word on constitutional matters, as the Constitution, with the text of the Constitution that it's actually in force? What is the importance of it for a democratic regime?
Well, it's important because our system of checks and balances in our government is designed to avoid hasty decisions made too quickly in a way that would affect or drown out or otherwise harm the minority. Constitution in many ways is a counter-majoritarian document where merely because on a Monday 50% plus one decides something's a good idea, that doesn't mean it becomes a good idea in perpetuity forever. This is why we have two branches in the Congress, the House and the Senate. They both have to pass the same legislation. It has to be presented to the president. The president then can sign or veto. And then if there's disputes over what it means, it goes to the courts. Constitution is similar in that if someone wants to say someone violated the Constitution, ultimately the courts can decide that, subject, of course, to the amendment. Two kinds of issues at the risk of overgeneralizing come up in constitutional law. One is whether other branches are performing their obligations or violating their obligations, or is a private citizen's rights being violated, meaning someone's free speech rights are being denied, or they're denied equal protection of the laws. These are words from our Constitution. It's important I think in a democratic society that a court is able to act independently of the political will of the day and to able to say what the law is in a way that protects all, so that things do not change overnight. So I think it's at the end of the day, our court, when it gets criticized, it tends to be criticized for being out of sync with where the majority of the people are, but that's by design, and it's designed to make sure things do not change too quickly and hurt those who do not have as big a voice as those who happen to win a particular short-term political dispute.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Eric.
Listen, I think this is a wonderful opportunity, Rodrigo, for your students to hear from not just the former White House counsel, but a constitutional professor of law. And I'm learning a lot. I hope your students get the benefit of it as well. I would like to have a few other questions if there are, but I think it is interesting to sort of focus for Brazilians, which are in a period of some crisis now, to hear from someone that operated at the highest levels of our government about this respect and tension among the co-equal branches and how that makes the democracy strong. It's something that our country's done for a great long while, and it's been a great benefit.
Yeah, that's great, Eric. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
That's great. I think Alaor has some questions about this issue. But it's good to hear from you. I don't know, Alaor, if you can go on with your questions, and then we can shift a little bit from the starting point regarding the Federal Supreme Court to this specific issue that Eric told us.
Yes, we can go.
Okay, so your questions, Alaor?
Yes, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to have you with us here. And I would like to. So you were at the Federal Commission for the elections for about 5 years, I think. And I would like to hear about the impact of fake news at elections. It's we have a discussion right now here in Germany, in Brazil as well, about the impact of fake news. And do you think the fake news are a regulatory problem, or it can be as well a criminal issue? What do you think about it?
Well, in America, in our Constitution, our First Amendment talks about free speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, and the like, freedom of association, freedom to redress grievances, peaceably assemble. So we have a long tradition of the answer to speech you do not like is more speech, not less speech. So for many, many years, that's been our model. It remains our model. I think it works. I think when one tries to have the government decide what is correct and not correct, that becomes sort of self-fulfilling in a way, because the government would inherently probably skew it in favor of whoever the current government is. And that's why, coming out of a Revolutionary War, we were very insistent that, at least in our history, the Crown of England could never do again what the Crown of England had done, in large part that prompted our revolution so long ago. The internet is the latest. Is the latest chapter in free speech. I think in the modern age, where it gets tricky is how fast information can now spread. So if someone intentionally decides to spread a falsehood, it is very tough to nip that in the bud, stop it, or otherwise halt it. Whereas back in the days of print journalism, information moved much slower. Things were more orderly. There were editors, that sort of thing. But now everyone with an internet connection can be their own newspaper, so to speak. So it really puts pressure more on our defamation laws and what the standard is there. Our Supreme Court, almost 50 years ago, about 45 years ago, in a case called New York Times versus Sullivan, decided a case where the New York Times, one of our major newspapers, had been sued over publishing something that the plaintiff felt was wrong and was caused injury. The court held that in order to sue, if you're a public figure, so if you're an elected official, for example, you have to show not only that the statement is false, and not that it's not just unfair or not how you would say it, but actually provably false, and that falsehood was made with either a reckless disregard of the truth or with actual malice. So this is a very high standard the Supreme Court has articulated to ensure the First Amendment guarantee of free speech and press is maintained. However, some people do maintain that standard and still win. Doesn't happen often, but they still can. So you still have a ability to redress your grievance and try to mitigate your harm by going to court and saying it's harmed you. The idea of fake news, I think, is a shorthand for what has really happened in the internet age, where folks post what purports to be news stories, where really they're more commentary, but yet they are held out as news stories. They don't necessarily get the details right, and they sort of correct it as they go. When it was print journalism, I remember journalists calling and saying their deadline was at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. because they had to finish the story, get it to their editor. The editor needed an hour to edit the story. It then had to go to print, and it went to the print room, and the large machines would print newspapers. Now, one click and you can disseminate something widely. And that's really a challenge where we are. And it's not just necessarily jurisdiction specific. One one post on the internet can go everywhere. So it's something that I think a lot of people are looking at. But in America, our tradition has been the more speech is better than the government selecting what speech people could hear. And in a democracy, I think you want voters to have more, not less. And at least in America, I found that our voters are smart enough to shift through that which is true and that which is false when around election time. And I think our voters have managed to get it pretty close to right when they look at all that is out there. And that's because there's a lot of material out there. It's not just limited to one or two outlets with some filter or censor deciding what one gets to see. And it's routine for Americans to seek out their own information, read books they want to read, watch the shows they want to watch, and the like. The one danger that's going on, danger is probably too strong a word, but people are now sort of self-selecting their news, where if you go on various feeds of websites, social media platforms, and the like, you see stories that people that are your friends with or connected with have clicked on, so those stories come up, so you can kind of create your own echo chamber where you're only really seeing one side of the story. I think the more thoughtful people will seek out both sides, and I think that's been the case. If you look back in history, there was a time in America where newspapers were overtly on one side or the other on the partisan divide. They were very clear. A lot of towns had two papers. One was for the Republicans, one was for the Democrats, or one was for the Whigs, one was for depending on what the parties were called at a particular era. And we did just fine as a democracy. So I think at the end of the day, I prefer the American model, where we actually have in our Constitution a protection for the press and for speech.
That's interesting. And it does go back to what you said, Don, earlier about the need for an independent and a co-equal judiciary. The fact that we have, and it's our First Amendment freedom of speech, will always be protected. So even if 53% of the country right now wants to silence one group or censor what they say, that's where the Supreme Court will come in and not allow that censorship, even if the majority of the country wants to do it. And that's an incredible part of this democracy in America.
What's interesting about that, an obvious follow-up is, well, doesn't that put the court in a position where they're deciding? And the answer is really no, because if one looks at history, things evolve, norms evolve, people change their mind. But if you look at the history of the Supreme Court, when one calls someone a liberal jurist or one calls someone a conservative jurist, that tends to be labels that attach in a particular moment in history that then flip over time. 50 years ago, it was the so-called liberal jurists who were protecting First Amendment speech, the ones appointed by people who claim to be liberal. Today, on our Supreme Court, it's the so-called conservative jurists that are much more hardline First Amendment protectors. The labels change, but the philosophy stays the same. To relate back to the reference to the fact I served on the Federal Election Commission, which governs our campaign financing and who pays for various advertisements and the like, there's a lot of free speech issues that come up in our campaigns and elections. And I found when I was at the Federal Election Commission, I was just as likely to cite Justices Brennan and Douglas, who are considered so-called liberal jurists, as I was to cite Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Scalia, who are known as conservative jurists, because when it came to the First Amendment, their views were remarkably similar, even though if one reads just the headlines in the paper or the critiques of the court, they try to put justices in various camps of liberal versus conservative, and those are labels that attach at certain points in time, but don't really tell you how judges really think. And it shows that our system works, because just merely because you were appointed by one president doesn't mean you're beholden to that president or that particular philosophy or whatever was in vogue at the time. The court tends to be much more steady and consistent, which I think is a healthy thing, particularly for free speech, because at the end of the day, the courts have been fairly consistent at protecting the ability to speak your mind.
Yeah. Maybe we have time for just one more question, if that works.
Sure. Alaor, do you want to make your final question? And then maybe if Don allows, I just add one in the middle of Alaor's, just for me to have mine also. And then it's going to be our last.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Thank you, John. A very short question. You talked about campaign financing. That's a very interesting subject. And that leads us to a very important question about the lobby. There's no lobby regulation in Brazil, and sometimes it's difficult it's difficult. The limits between lobby, also legal lobby, and bribery at the politics are not easy to determine. So I would like to hear about the lobby experience in the US, and how do you think we can put the limit between legal lobby and bribery? Where are these limits? Thank you.
It's a excellent question. Thank you. Not an easy answer, but I begin where I tend to begin most of my answers, with our Constitution. And again, in our First Amendment, the right to redress grievances before the government is something that's protected. And from there comes the ability to go to Congress and voice your opinion as to what the law ought to be. And that includes, if you want to hire someone who knows their way around Congress, you can do that. We have disclosure of lobbyists now in our country. Lobbyists have to file reports. They have to disclose who their clients are and the like. So there is some sense of who's doing what. And there is transparency there. This is true in also our states. Some states are a little more disclosure heavy than our federal government. Some are a little less, but that's another check on our system. There's no really one government that does everything. There's different things where the states do things, the federal government does other things. So it's sometimes not even the same subject matter. I should have mentioned that in response to the earlier question. A question of state law, the U.S. Supreme Court really isn't the final word on that. State Supreme Court would be in that case, and the U.S. Supreme Court would defer to what the state said the law is in those kinds of cases. So even then, the Supreme Court's not final. Bribery is when you have a quid pro quo exchange of something of value for official action. So if you want someone to vote a certain way on a piece of legislation, and you say, if you vote yes, I will give you $50,000, that's a bribe. If you want a government contract, say you are selling something to the government, and you go through the process, and the decision maker in the government is deciding who's going to get the contract, and you go to that person and say, if I give you $50,000, you will give me the contract, and that would be a bribe. We have a lot of procurement laws in government contracting to avoid that transparent and blatant bribe. There's a bid process, there's a contest process, there's a whole procedure when one gets government contracts to avoid bribery. Bribery on government contracts happens much more at the state and local level. They don't have nearly the procurement rules that we have at the federal level. But at the end of the day, there is always going to be a little bit of a tension between someone paying somebody for an official act, whereas somebody needs to talk to that person. And that raises the campaign finance issue, because if one contributes to a politician, that ought not mean that that person's presumptively trying to influence policy by giving a campaign contribution. More often than not, people give campaign contributions because they believe in the policies of the elected official already, not to change the elected official's mind. It's much easier to elect somebody who already agrees with you than to elect them and then try to change their mind by bribing them. That's not really the way people who are knowledgeable try to influence policy. In America, when it comes to bribery, that's a criminal violation. That's subject to various due process safeguards, one of which is statutes have to be stated with particularity. So you have to know the rules before you violate them. It's not a situation where In the criminal context, you can do something, and then after the fact, a judge or a prosecutor is empowered to decide whether you did was legal or illegal. It's supposed to be clearly stated ahead of time. So what that means, the bribery statutes are not going to reach every sort of activity that some may think looks like something that they don't agree with. Instead, it reaches the clear money for policy. And really, that's probably the best balance, because otherwise you would have the government in the business of investigating every contact between private citizens and their elected representatives. And that simply can't be something that would really work in a sort of democratically elected free society.
If I may, just to comment before we end, although this pulled very much from Don's constitutional professor sort of role and something his students find very valuable, I have to be very grateful to have Don as a partner when this country is dealing with a tremendous crisis that's worldwide, the COVID-19 crisis. And like all the different governments, the US government has been moving very quickly to sort of bring money to places that need it with, is it $3 trillion? And the regulations involved in getting this money out, most people can't understand all these changes in regulations that are coming at such a rapid pace. But Don, because of his involvement with this administration, with this government, and his understanding of how government works, has been a tremendous resource to the partners at Jones Day and to the clients, whether they be, giant Brazilian corporations that have meat production plants in the United States and have to deal with all the different regulations on how to use their employees at those meatpacking plants, or maybe they apply for funds. And Don is an excellent resource when it comes to that, not just constitutional law questions. So I'm very grateful to Don. Don, thank you for doing this.
Sure, the constitutional law questions, that's the fun stuff. My practice is dealing with government regulation, so executive branch agencies and Congress. For example, because of the COVID situation, there's been a lot of taxpayer money appropriated for loan programs and the like. Those have their own complicated regulatory structures. We advise clients on those. But then once you take government money, Congress also believes it has its own investigatory authority, and they're already asking questions. Most of those questions have been Congress asking the executive branch how they've administered the program, but usually that comes and goes, and then they start asking individual recipients how the program went, and occasionally you'll see major congressional investigations on things over the years, and maybe there'll be one this time, maybe they won't be. There certainly was in our financial crisis of 2008. The world really shared that crisis, where there was a lot of congressional oversight, investigations, subpoenas, and even criminal prosecutions over what happened there. So hopefully that doesn't happen this time. But my time in the White House turns out to not just be academic. When one reads American newspapers, you see references to the Defense Production Act, the Insurrection Act, a number of statutes that most lawyers have never heard of. But as counsel to the president, I actually had to be the sort of world subject matter expert on those, and still understand all that is going on, at least legally. I can't really speak to what's going on elsewhere. I try to stick in my lane as a lawyer, but I appreciate Eric bringing that up, that I just don't talk fancy constitutional law. I actually do quite a bit of intersection with the US government is really kind of my specialty. I'm kind of an expert in a way of intersecting with the government, and lead the government regulation practice in the US for Jones Day. So we try to solve problems that people have when they deal with the federal government, to a certain extent state governments as well, but primarily our federal government.
Excellent.
Excellent. So from our side, it was a great experience. Thank you very much. It's great to hear you speaking not only about the institutions and about some doubts that we have here in Brazil. It's great to listen about the American experience and also about your specific experience in the government. So it was great. Thank you so much. We had lots of questions, but we understand that the time has to be limited. But thank you very much. Our institute is open for you anytime you ever wish to return. I'd like to thank you, Professor Estellita. Also, thank you very much, Heloísa. Thank you, Alaor. Thank you, Ney. And thank you, my friend Eric. It was a great afternoon for us. Hope you enjoyed it, Don. I hope it was good for you as it was for us.
Thank you for having me. Maybe someday I can do it in person when this all settles out.
Yeah, look forward to that, Don.
Okay. Take care.
Muito bom.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heloísa.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.